ever about.
In chimpanzee Patty, brainwaves telemetered from the left and right amygdala were received and automatically analyzed by an online analog computer. This instrument was instructed to recognize a specific pattern of waves. The computer was also instructed to activate a stimulator. Each time the waves appeared, radio signals were sent to Patty's brain to stimulate a point known to have negative reinforcing properties. Electrical stimulation of one cerebral structure was contingent upon specific EEG patterns in another area of the brain, and the whole process of identification of information and command of action was decided by the online computer.
In this process, Patty's very capacity for carrying out certain behaviors was drastically and rapidly altered through a very sophisticated form of computer-driven conditioning, which continued until the offending brain activity was no longer physically possible.
2 hours after the brain-to-computer feedback was established, activity in the amygdaloid nucleus was reduced to 50%. 6 days later, with daily 2-hour periods of feedback, drastically reduced to only 1% of normal occurrence.
The experiment showed how brainwaves could be singled out and virtually eradicated. Using the autocorrelator, EEG expression was filtered, altered, and domesticated. The project moved forward.
Does it tamper with minds?
But no matter what the cost, the American people are prepared to pay the price of victory.
Telling the people to accept these monstrous treatments that do nothing but destroy brain tissue and dehumanize people.
Let us march toward the clean world our hands can make.
Does it tamper with minds? Does it tamper with minds? And if so, does anyone have the right to do that?
Leonard would die 3 decades later at the age of 65 at the Bedford VA just outside Boston, having spent the latter half of his life a totally disabled, heavily medicated mental patient in a psych ward. Despite having completely ruined a man's life after mutilating his brain, Doctors Mark and Irvin continued to publish success stories about Leonard's case up until at least 1975.
But I wouldn't, even if they were convicted of murder, want to unleash these psychosurgeons on them. There are protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Believe me, it is crueler to have done to you what was done to Leonard Kyle than to be put to death. It's crueler and more hopeless and more horrible.
In May 1972, Dr. William Sweet again personally approached the Senate Labor and Health Education and Welfare Appropriations Committee for more money. This time, Sweet was asking for $1 million to branch out, to open a series of violence institutes like the Boston Project for the study of violent behavior across the nation. Sweet stated on the record that his appearance before Congress was on behalf of not just himself and colleagues at Harvard and MGH, including Dr. Vernon Mark, but also the Brain Research Institute of UCLA, in addition to UCLA's Neuropsychiatric Institute, under the medical direction of Dr. Louis Jolyon West. Dr. West spent his entire career first in the military and later in academia, researching all manner of behavior modification, everything from cults to communist mind control techniques, dissociation, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, hallucinogens, for which he attended cybernetician Frank Fremont Smith's Macy's Conference on LSD, social engineering, and more. As a psychiatrist, Dr. West reportedly examined Lee Harvey Oswald's assassin Jack Ruby, homicidal cult leader Charles Manson, infamous kidnap victim Patty Hearst, the man convicted of assassinating RFK Sirhan Sirhan, and even convicted Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh. He also reportedly monitored Haight-Ashbury's so-called acid ghetto before and during the Summer of Love. It wouldn't be revealed until years later that Dr. West was involved in CIA MKUltra research, that he was the main contractor in charge of Subproject 43 with a top-secret clearance, a project involving the altering of personality through sensory isolation and environmental manipulation, including the use of drugs and hypnosis. Dr. West's book Hallucinations is dedicated to aforementioned cybernetician Heinrich Kluver, of Kluver-Bucy syndrome fame. Unsurprisingly, right on cue, Dr. Irvin and other Boston Project associates were on their way to California ahead of Dr. West's new project, as mentioned by Dr. Sweet to Congress, the Center for the Study and Reduction of Violence at UCLA. Sounding just like Drs. Mark, Irvin, Sweet, and Delgado, Dr. West decried the growing plague of violence as our greatest ill, and claimed his was just the project President LBJ's Violence Commission had called for to cure it. The massive project would take many of the same ideas from Boston and expand them to screening the general population at large in the name of preventing, detecting, controlling, and not just treating but pre-treating all manner of antisocial and violent behavior, to somehow stop it before it could occur. Broad in scope, the project called for experimenting on people of all ages and from all sectors of society, including children, menstruating women, anyone deemed predisposed to alcoholism, criminals, mental patients, people diagnosed with brain disease and dysfunction, and more. Race was obviously considered a cause of violence, as the project involved plans to monitor students and introduce experimental anti-violence treatment programs at 2 different junior high schools, one in a predominantly black ethnic area, and the other in a predominantly Chicano area. A wide variety of experimental treatment methods would be employed, including everything from newly developed but unapproved chemical castration drugs, to monitoring, quote, abnormal electrical brain activity, specifically using surgical intervention by implanting tiny electrodes deep within the brain, end quote. Dr. West noted it is even possible to record bioelectrical changes in the brains of freely moving subjects through the use of remote monitoring techniques. Sound familiar? A full third of the research projects the center ostensibly planned to carry out were based upon attempts to link violence prediction to what they deemed abnormal brain waves.
Irvin, for example, made remarks that to the effect that being a do-gooder or goody two-shoes or nice to people, that was a pretty good idea, but you wouldn't get any money from that. So they knew that the way to get money was to play on political and social fears and on racism. And these men are just riding that horse of violence, riding that horse of I'm right, you're wrong. I'm white, you're black. I'm a neurosurgeon, you're a nobody. I think they were just riding all of those negative human emotions, integrating it into totalitarian philosophies.
The ultimate goal of all this research was described as the ability to predict violent behavior, the development of mass screenings for the general public in order to officially label any violence-prone individuals of all ages before they actually committed an act of violence, and then initiate preventative treatment in the form of behavior modification of such individuals, even though they had not committed any crimes or done anything wrong yet. For many opponents, the UCLA project was a real-life version of the Stanley Kubrick film A Clockwork Orange. The center was described in a congressional hearing as a laboratory for the Department of Corrections and law enforcement officials with the diaphanous veneer of UCLA. Prisoners and patients at state hospitals and medical correctional facilities would also be used as guinea pigs for this experimental research, including those being held at Vacaville, Camarillo, and Atascadero. Vacaville had recently had its experimental maximum psychiatric diagnostic unit shut down, following public outcry after it came to light that 3 prisoners had been amygdalotomized to inhibit their aggressive tendencies in 1968, with disastrous results, all of which the prison attempted to deny ever happened at first.
One of the things that I had not imagined early on was all of this might have political implications. It didn't dawn on me. I'm embarrassed at how naive I was about life. I had no idea the treachery of outstanding people in the field of medicine, psychiatry, neurology, neurosurgery.
Through all of this, Dr. Bregan continued to publish articles and make public appearances speaking out against the Orwellian violence centers and their experimental treatments.
I was not going to stop. I was just not going to stop about this.
Again, unsurprisingly, in the initial proposal dated September 1972, Dr. Frank Irvin was listed as a UCLA faculty member who had already submitted research to the project before it even officially began on violence in the brain, bioelectrics, and behavioral studies. Once again, it became apparent this project had already been approved in the upper echelons of government, when then California Governor Ronald Reagan proudly announced the formation and $1 million funding of the UCLA Center in his January 1973 State of the State address. In the weeks that followed, however, the plans for the center were leaked to an already anxious public by Director West's opponents inside his own neuropsychiatric institute. Protests began breaking out on the UCLA campus and outside the NPI. Protests against the use of psychosurgery to curb violence. Protests against what some called a clockwork orange at UCLA. Protests against the obviously racist and sexist overtones of the proposal, and considering Dr. Irvin's timely presence at UCLA just prior to the project's announcement, protests against Drs. West and Irvin personally. Several students were even arrested after they chained themselves to Dr. West's desk. The project's proposal went through at least 4 revisions as Dr. West frantically attempted to rebrand his new violence center and regain public trust. Frank Irvin's name was removed from all subsequent drafts altogether. So was any trace of reference to psychosurgery, something that in the meantime Dr. Mark redefined in journal articles specifically as the creation of lesions in the brain and not the drilling into the skull for the placement of electrodes. This weak semantic argument allowed Dr. West to proclaim that his center was never going to be involved in psychosurgery of any kind, despite the fact that the placement of deep brain electrodes in test subjects, possibly including children, was a stated objective in his first proposal draft. By 1974, they even took the word violence out of the title, renaming the whole thing as the UCLA Project on Life-Threatening Behavior. Despite all the edits and reassurances, internal documents continued to get leaked to the press, and public opposition continued to build. Funding for the project itself was finally pulled and the project officially abandoned, after a shocking letter was leaked which hinted at something far more sinister than what Dr. West had adamantly tried to sell to the public. The letter was written by Dr. West to a man who appeared to be his good personal friend, Dr. J.M. Stubblebine, then Director of Health in the California State Office of Health Planning. It read, "Dear Stubb, I am in possession of confidential information to the effect that the Army is prepared to turn over Nike missile bases to state and local agencies for non-military purposes. They may look with special favor on health-related applications. Such a Nike missile base is located in the Santa Monica Mountains within a half-hour's drive of the Neuropsychiatric Institute. It is accessible but relatively remote. The site is securely fenced and includes various buildings and improvements making it suitable for prompt occupancy. If this site were made available to the Neuropsychiatric Institute as a research facility, perhaps initially as an adjunct to the new Center for Prevention of Violence, we could put it to very good use. Comparative studies could be carried out there in an isolated but convenient location of experimental or model programs for the alteration of undesirable behavior. Such programs might include control of drug or alcohol abuse, modification of chronic antisocial or impulsive aggressiveness, etc. My understanding is that a direct request by the governor or another appropriate officer of the state to the Secretary of Defense, or of course the President, would be most likely to produce prompt results. Needless to say, I stand available to participate in any way that might be helpful. Louis Jolyon West, M.D., Medical Director. And there it was, in black and white. Dr. West planned to use his confidential political back channels to acquire a newly decommissioned Nike missile base, complete with underground facilities and nestled high in a remote area of the Santa Monica Mountains, and turn it into a research facility to perform his experiments, altering people's behavior in a place he personally described as securely fenced and isolated. And that was the last straw. Public outcry drowned out Dr. West's best attempts at downplaying his center's true goals. The project was, at least officially, shut down.
We are advancing rapidly in the pattern recognition of electrical correlates of behavior.
Dr. Delgado's highly publicized taming of the bull was just the opening act before the real show began.
Automatic learning is possible by feeding signals directly into specific neuronal structures without conscious participation.
What struck me about Delgado, first of all, was that he was a political philosopher. He wasn't just a psychosurgeon that put electrodes in the brains of people and bulls. And he was a political philosopher who saw the fundamental principles of America, the Declaration of Independence in particular, as being scientifically incorrect based on the neuroscience of the 1960s. That humans aren't individuals. They're under the influence of all kinds of forces. That means they're not individuals. They may feel self-important, but they're not important. And they may think they had rights as individuals, but the society had rights, not the individual. His view was 100% consistent with society versus the individual, doing anything to the individual in the name of the social good.
Humanity behaves in general no more intelligently than animals would under the same circumstances. And this alarming reality is due largely to spiritual pride. Violence is a product of culture and environment, and is an extreme form of aggression. Man may react to unpleasant and painful stimuli with violence. A major role of education is to build internal controls in human beings so that they can withstand external pressures and maintain internal equilibrium.
It was a totalitarian philosophy under which he was doing social control and personal control of people.
Cybernetics was first described by Norbert Wiener as communication and control in the animal and the machine. Human languages have remained complex in their unraveling and interpretation. Even computer languages must be defined. In cybernetic terms, EEG brainwaves represented the world's first known non-symbolic language. able to directly communicate signals and meaning into the partitions of the mind. Direct communication was key. Man had uncovered a pathway to decode brainwaves, to interpret EEGs, and to encode reciprocal messages that a computer understands and responds to automatically. This was sophisticated, technologically driven mind control in action. Most people simply can't grasp such a thing. Can't think it, imagine it, or believe it. An emotional plea is deaf to the drone of society, and each person learns to live according to its rhythms. Saul Sell's work on MKUltra Subproject 119, proposed and put into action in 1959, sought to activate the human organism by remote electronic means using bioelectric sensors, a lead with 24 channels of brainwave data, recording and data processing devices, and what Sells called an autocorrelator, the very machine the MIT and MGH teams developed to analyze and interpret EEGs. While the first autocorrelator of 1955 took 20 minutes to analyze Norbert Wiener's brain, subsequent versions of the device could surely approach real time, and with infinitely more channels of data. By the 1960s, Dr. Delgado demonstrated that his devices could automatically monitor, correct, and recondition the very mental capacities of his experimental subjects. And that is an idea unlikely to be forgotten.
Can the human mind be controlled and remain human? Many of today's developments were predicted 35 years ago in what was then called a fantasy. Its title, Brave New.
Is the mind merely a function of the brain? Or is it a separate but closely related element? In the past 50 years, we have come to recognize that in the brain there is an amazing automatic sensory and motor computer that utilizes the conditioned reflexes. And there is a highest brain mechanism that is closely related to what men have long referred to as consciousness, or the mind, or spirit. But the mind, I surmise, can give direction only through the mind's brain mechanism. It is all very much like programming a private computer. The program comes to an electrical computer from without. The same is true of each biological computer. Purpose comes to it from outside its own mechanism. This suggests that the mind has energy. There I must leave it.
The 1967 Webster's Dictionary defines cybernetics as the comparative study of the automatic control systems formed by the nervous system and brain, and by mechanical-electrical communication systems. In 2008, the CIA declassified the historical record of the agency's Office of Scientific Intelligence, 1949 to 1968. In it, there are a few mentions of cybernetics, including a classified research program and a biocybernetics working group, the responsibility for which fell under a CIA medical subcommittee. References were also made to Soviet cybernetics programs, East-West technology exchanges, and something called World Cybernetics, even though this document wasn't declassified until 2008. All of the pages describing the CIA's cybernetics program are still redacted to this day.
I have puzzled over human evil for a long time. And I'm not sure I have more to say about it than anybody else, except I'm willing to call it human evil, which most folks aren't anymore. What was driving Mark Irvin and Sweet? What was driving Delgado?
Dr. Jose Delgado wrote that conquering the human mind is a national goal at parity with conquering poverty or landing a man on the moon. The main aim is to establish a scientific foundation for the creation of a future psycho-civilized society. But how many people knew that humanity's new future course toward a psycho-civilized society could be traced back to a highly organized global program to unlock the black box of man's mind, established during World War II, funded by elite foundations, government health and intelligence agencies, and military research branches, run through Ivy League schools, hospitals, mental health facilities, and prisons, and involving a diffuse global network of intelligence agents, neurologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, physiologists, anthropologists, mathematicians, and cyberneticians, all seemingly working under the same United Nations UNESCO goal for decades: how to create peace in the minds of men.
The governments of the states parties to this Constitution, on behalf of their peoples, declare that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed.
In summary, therefore, there is no evidence that the Soviets have any techniques or agents capable of producing particular behavioral patterns which are not available in the West.
Form figure eight, run a couple on the right, run a couple on the right, run a couple on the right. A form figure eight, run a couple on the right, and chase the goose around. Round and around and round and round, round and round and round and round, round and round and round and round, chase the goose around. Form figure eight, run a couple on the right, run a couple on the right, run a couple on the right. Form figure eight, run a couple on the right, and chase the goose around. Round and round and round and round, round and round and round and round, round and round and round and round, chase the goose around.